Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you very much, Agnes, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 25th day of October in the year 2016. It is 2 weeks before Election Day here in this nation. I was going to say here in West Virginia, but it's true everywhere else in the country as well. November 8th is 2 weeks from today. And again, yesterday I did have an appointment. I apologize for missing a live broadcast yesterday, but I had an appointment to try to schedule a couple of TV spots as we get closer to the election. The available spots are becoming less and less, and so I was meeting a friend who works for one of the TV stations here, and I bought some TV time. And he's in the process of putting together a schedule for me. I've got a couple of 30-second spots that I want to run. And this evening we have a kickoff, a campaign kickoff in Summers County, which is the home county for my district, and I'll be going to that this evening. So it just seems like there's more to do than I can do. I guess I used to do this much easier when 25 years ago. And it seems to be a little bit more difficult for me to keep up with now, but 2 more weeks to go and I'm doing it. If I can survive another 2 weeks and if my wife will hang in there with me, God love her, she's tough. I owe her one after this, let me tell you. And she said to me one night last week, we were sitting here, and she said, if you ever do anything like this again, I'll kill you. And I thought, oh boy. And it's pretty hectic. But in a way, it's fun. And it's an experience that I'll look back on and be glad that I did. And again, it has nothing to do with winning or losing. I obviously want to win, but on the other hand, I think the experience of campaigning itself is a positive, and I really think that everybody would benefit from such an experience as this. I look forward to hearing from you here at the Virtual Center. Not just do I, but those others who listen as well. If you remember the last time that we were live, which was last Wednesday, Horst called in our second hour and, as he usually does, engaged in some really very, very provocative, interesting conversation. I just think it adds so much to the program. And so I do invite you to participate in our program by giving us a call and sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you would like to drop me a line personally in an email and share your ideas that way, I'd be glad to do the very best I can to get your thoughts and your ideas on the air for you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do remind you that we have our Facebook page. If you go to the homepage for Facebook and type in the search box at the top of the page, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. Earlier today, 2 or 3 hours ago, I posted a piece on representation. And I do believe that probably will be the bulk of our broadcast today. At least I intend it that way. I don't know how far we'll get. I plan to do a little bit more with that subject here on the air than I did on Facebook. But I did want to get something on the website, and I did want to, especially since we didn't do a program yesterday, I wanted to get something on there because it's been several days since I had posted anything on our Facebook page. So again, if you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have indeed access to our Facebook page. I also invite you, I put the same thing on the other page, which is my own campaign page. If you go to W.A. O'Brien, candidate for the West Virginia House of Delegates, and I'm trying to isolate campaign-related material for that particular Facebook page. But if you go to that, you will see that I put the piece on representation on that page as well. So with that, then, I'd like to begin our program. As I'm sure you know, it's Tuesday. We do begin 1/2 hour later on Tuesdays, so we usually try to make up some of it by foregoing our 5-minute break between the first and second hour. We have been pretty much overlooking or ignoring that on our Tuesdays and just going right through, and that way we're able to recover 10 minutes or so of the half hour we've lost. Before we get into a topic, there are a couple of things that I'd like to share with you. One of them is we've talked a lot, more than 3 or 4 times over the course of the months when we were talking about political campaigns. The so-called no tax increase pledge that is being promoted by the Americans for Tax Reform, which is the group headed by Grover Norquist in Washington, D.C. Well, over the weekend, I received in the mail a copy of the pledge, along with a cover letter from Grover Norquist with an invitation to sign that pledge. Obviously, I didn't do it, but I did keep the paperwork because I wanted to take the opportunity to share this with you here at the Virtual Center. I don't know how many people have actually seen the pledge or seen the literature that is associated with it. The implication, of course, in the cover letter is that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence, these people argue, to make the point or support the point that stronger economic performance is related to controlling and limiting and reducing taxes. The implication, of course, is that taxes inhibit economic activity, inhibit economic growth, and understandably so, in that taxes provide income for government. The point that I would make, and I think, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to share it with you. First of all, let me share with you the pledge. It's entitled Taxpayer Protection Pledge. And it says, I, and then there's a blank for your name, pledge to the taxpayers of the state of, in my case, West Virginia, that I will oppose and vote against any and all efforts to increase taxes. It's to be signed, dated, with 2 witnesses, and mailed to Washington, D.C. And the defense of the article, of the pledge, is that it is in the best interests of the nation. There are 2 sides to this coin. The Grover Norquist side, of course, is related to the inverse relationship between taxes and economic activity. The assumption being that when taxes go up, economic activity goes down. So the implication is that the reverse of that is also true. Namely, that when taxes go down, economic activity goes up. That, as we know, has been and continues to be the major argument of those continually advocating additional tax cuts for businesses and corporations. The assumption is that as taxes go down, economic activity goes up. The only issue that I have with that is that while it is part of what we call, seemingly call, a law of nature, excuse me, a law of nature, so to speak, like, as Adam Smith talked about with the idea of supply and demand, that it just functions in and of itself. So the logic of the Grover Norquist conservative position obviously is that if taxes go down, that means that there's additional revenue in the hands of those who would ordinarily be paying those taxes. And therefore, since they are employers, since they are corporations and small businesses, then that means that gives them more money to spend, which puts more capital, more fluid, liquid capital into the economy, which stimulates jobs and stimulates growth and economic activity and all the rest of it. All of that's fine, provided you assume that there's some natural law that governs it. Fact of the matter is, there's no law, there's nothing that requires the people whose taxes are cut to invest that money into economic activity. In fact, what we've seen, and one of the major economic issues of our time, is the degree to which corporations and businesses have taken profits, record profits, out of the economy and invested them in other businesses or other activities, if you will, which do nothing to generate economic activity. That's what we've been talking about. We have pretty much experienced a recovery from the recession of 07-08. The stock market has recovered. Business activity is as good as, if not better, than it was prior to the recession. So the fact of the matter is, why aren't there jobs? Where are the jobs that supposedly go with that? Well, the fact of the matter is, many of these corporations are active on an international scale. Many of them have opened overseas offices and found other ways to reduce their taxes. And the fact of the matter is, many of these companies have put paying their shareholders first rather than generating economic activity. So the fact of the matter is, even though profits are up, even though stock values are up, even though shareholders are doing better in many cases than they've ever done before, the fact of the matter is the nation is desperate for jobs. And the reason is that the Grover Norquist assumption that with lower taxes comes increased economic activity is showing itself to be just that, an assumption and nothing more. The only way that works is if the individuals involved do it. But the fact of the matter is there's nothing making them do that. And so consequently, the assumption that Grover Norquist makes here falls flat. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that taxes generate income for government, revenue for government. So by definition, if you reduce taxes, you are reducing government's income, which means you are making it less and less possible for government to engage in the various activities associated with governance. By definition, if you continue to cut taxes, you are, and this is a Grover Norquist quote, you are effectively starving the beast. You are denying government the revenue it needs to govern. Consequently, you are forcing government to suspend services and activities that, in its wisdom, it has decided needed to be done. You are imposing mandatory cuts on the size and cost of government. I think that's understandable. That makes perfect sense as well. However, the question that seems to me we must address is whether, in fact, the tax pledge is designed to lower taxes in order to increase economic activity, or whether, in fact, its real intent is to lower taxes in order to force the shrinking of government. And the idea being that the smaller and less active government becomes, the less regulation of corporate behavior there is. And so, in a sense, what the tax pledge is doing is making government's job of regulating the economy more and more difficult, which means you are giving more and more unrestricted freedom to the private sector. There is every indication in the world that that might be the real purpose of the pledge, not economic activity. In fact, when you look at real behavior, corporate behavior in the real world, I would argue that the second case seems to have much more validity than the first. Therefore, if that's true, and I'm saying if because I don't know, but if that's true, if the real purpose of this is to render government impotent in order to free corporations and businesses from regulation, then the tax pledge itself is duplicitous. It's deceptive. It's less than honest. And I won't sign it. But thousands are signing it. And one of the reasons that I was particularly interested in it is because here in our own state, in West Virginia, 26 members of our House of Delegates signed this pledge. And as our legislative session came to a close earlier this year, and the legislature had failed to produce a budget, and therefore mandated that the governor call the legislature back into special session in order to do its constitutional duty, which was to pass the budget. That's the only constitutional requirement on the legislature, and they didn't do it. Here in West Virginia, in the face of a budget that is currently approaching a deficit currently approaching $300 million, the state was forced to shell out $600,000 for the special legislative session to pass a budget because it wasn't passed during the regular 60-day session. And in the midst of the debate over why there wasn't a budget on time, it became clear, one thing that became clear during that discussion was that 26 members of the House of Delegates had signed this pledge, which means that the legislature's effort to pass a budget in the face of a mounting budget deficit, were being stymied in part by the fact that 26 members, more than 25% of the legislature, had taken a pledge never to raise taxes under any conditions. That made the government's job of drafting and approving a budget impossible. So, in a sense, the existence of this pledge contributed to a $600,000 expense for a special legislative session. At one point I did the numbers, and I think something like 23 or 24 of the 26 people who signed this pledge are Republican members of the legislature, the new majority. In fact, in the district that I'm running in, both of my Republican opponents signed the pledge. What that meant was that they were putting their ideology ahead of their responsibility to their constituents. They were denying government access to a major vehicle that it must use in order to govern effectively. So there's a tremendous amount of ideological significance to this particular pledge, it seems to me. And that's where I raised the issue of representation. Because by definition, if you are going to represent your constituents, that's what you promised when you ran for office, then it seems to me you have an obligation to listen to your constituents, listen to their ideas, raise the issues that you're going to have to vote on, solicit your constituents' points of view on many of these issues, so that when the time to vote comes up in the legislature, you will be informed of the various positions and issues that your constituents shared with you. It doesn't mean that they make the call and you carry it out. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that you have a responsibility to make the decision, but you're expected to do it with full awareness of what your constituents think and want on this particular issue. And if you can't give it to them, if you can't go along with them, then it seems to me during the discussion, the back and forth give and take that is supposed to happen in representative government before the issue comes to a vote in the legislature, many of these differences of opinion will be hammered out. In other words, if you have real substantive reasons why you're not willing or able to go along with your constituents on this particular issue, you have an obligation to tell them, share with them that information so that they have an opportunity to digest it as well. In other words, and I'm going back to Madison's Federalist number 10 here, as an elected representative, you have an obligation to educate your constituents on the perspective that you have, the insights that you have on some issues. They're looking at it from a very narrow, localist self-interested point of view. You're looking at it from a much more universal, much more cosmopolitan, much broader point of view. You have an obligation to share those considerations with your constituents so that in the process, their worldview becomes much more informed as well because of the education you've helped them achieve or acquire. If you took this pledge to never raise taxes ever under any circumstances, and you didn't tell them that, then you have put your own ideological preferences ahead of your responsibility to represent your constituents. I would suggest to you that's a violation of your oath to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state in which you're elected, in this case, West Virginia. This is very important, it seems to me. There's nothing that requires you as an elected representative to surrender your authority when it comes time to vote to your constituents. This is not a direct democracy we have. It is a representative democracy. And what that means is the people have the right to share their opinions and their ideas with their elected officials. As an elected official, you have an obligation to give them that opportunity. If your vote is already recorded, if your vote is already decided because of some pledge you took to some out-of-state interest, ideological interest, then it seems to me you have an obligation as part of the oath you take to support the Constitution. You have an obligation to share that with your constituents. There's nothing wrong with trying to educate them and convince them on the benefits of the pledge. There's nothing wrong with that. But to deny them knowledge of it, and then you as their elected representative to act in accordance with that pledge, which they know nothing about, it seems to me, is to violate your pledge to represent your own constituents. That is why I took up pen and decided that here we are 2 weeks from the end of the campaign. And the last substantive issue that I will address in the media, because I plan to put this particular piece in the local papers here in the last week before the election, to make it representation, because I believe it's that important. So with that, I'd like to use this pledge, the issue of this pledge, as a way to get into the entire issue of representation as we've looked at it, as we've examined it in the Federalist Papers and in the writing of the founders. Because I believe that it's very important for all of us to understand what this representative democracy is all about, what the founders believed it was all about, and what kinds of behaviors are necessary in order to act in accordance with the vision and the will and the principles of those who founded this nation. Let's go back and touch on a couple of issues that we've dealt with before. I didn't even go back and pull out the quotes from the particular Federalist Papers, but I think all of us have been there enough times to remember what they are. You will recall that the debate during the time of independence and immediately after revolved around the nature of Republican government. You will recall that James Madison, in fact, more than one of the Federalist Papers, made the point that whatever we do, and this was, of course, the Federalist Papers encouraging citizens to support ratification of the Constitution once it was drafted. Madison made the point in more than one Federalist paper that if nothing else is true, the one thing that must be true is that this government must be a republic. Madison said, and I think you'll recall this quotation, that republicanism is what Madison called the genius of the American people. That's a quote. The genius of the American people. You'll also recall, I think this was in Federalist number 13, but I'm not sure, so don't hold me to that. But I think you'll remember this. Madison made the point that whatever we do, however the Constitution is structured, it must be a Republican form of government because that's the only form of government that is consistent with the nature and the principles of the American people. And you'll recall that Madison went further than that. And he said, if anybody can prove that the Constitution as proposed, as adopted by the Constitutional Convention and sent out to the states for ratification, if anybody can prove that that Constitution is not Republican, is not consistent with Republican government, and that the Constitution would not institute republicanism in American society, rather it would eliminate it. Madison said, if that can be proven, then the people have an obligation to not ratify the Constitution of the United States. That's how clear and important Madison believed this issue was. It must be a republic. If the case can be made that the Constitution as proposed is not consistent with Republican government, then the Constitution ought to be defeated. Madison said that in one of the Federalist Papers, as you'll recall. At the time, the debate around Republican government revolved principally around the writings of Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu was considered to be the father, if you will, of the theory of republicanism. And Montesquieu argued that one requirement for republicanism to work effectively is the size of government itself, the size of the nation or the electoral region or district, whatever it happened to be. Montesquieu said that a republic had to be small because in order for Republican government to work, in order for representation to be effective, the representative had to know his constituents, and the constituents had to know the representative. There needed to be a back and forth exchange of ideas, information, and insights between them. That's the only way that a representative can effectively represent the interests of his constituents, is if he knows what those interests are. And the only way to find out what they are is to engage the constituents in discussion and conversation. And, as Madison said in Federalist Number 10, ultimately, education of the constituents. Madison, in the Federalist Papers, was faced with a challenge. Because the whole idea of the Articles of Confederation putting power in the states rather than in the central government was to preserve the viability of Republican government. The whole rationale for the Articles of Confederation was government is going to be Republican. The only way it can be Republican is to be small. Therefore, the ultimate authority, ultimate sovereignty had to rest in the state governments, not the national government. If it was in the national government over all the states, the republic would be so big, so large, and so diverse that there would be no way that the elected representative could know what the views of the constituents were. In fact, there would be so much diversity within the constituents that there really wouldn't be a point of view at all. There would be no guidance for the elected representative. That, you'll recall, was Madison's challenge with the Constitution. Because the Constitution did replace state power under the Articles with a powerful central government. Madison's challenge was he had to demonstrate that even though there was a strong central government which would have power over the states in certain areas, it did not violate the principles of republicanism. And Madison goes to great lengths in the Federalist Papers to talk about the size of constituencies, the size of congressional districts. They needed to be large enough, Madison says, but at the same time they couldn't be too large, because if they were, the elected representative wouldn't be able to know his people, know the will of his people. So Madison argued in the Federalist Papers that the Constitution of the United States was drafted with the idea of representation of the interests of the people in the forefront of consideration and concern. Madison had to prove that even though the Constitution created a strong central government, it did so without violating the principles of republicanism as articulated by Montesquieu. And we've spent a lot of time here at the Virtual Center looking at the specific arguments that both Madison and Hamilton made in order to make that case, that the Constitution was indeed Republican. Now the question becomes, what exactly is the day-to-day operation of republicanism in terms of the role of the elected representative? In other words, where's the power? Where's the power to decide? Is it in the constituents or is it in the representative? Madison believed when he structured the Constitution, designed the Constitution, that it had to be in the representative, but that the representative had to be given every means possible to know the constituency, know the people in the constituency, know what its interests were, so that the elected representative could make wise decisions on specific issues. In other words, it's not just simply a question of who makes the call, who has the power. The final decision is made by the representative, Madison believed, but it had to be made with the full input and understanding of constituents. They had to know what the issues were. They had to know what the representative knew, what kinds of considerations the representative had to consider in order to make this particular decision. In order to understand the nature of representation as the founders understood it, one must go to the writings of the British philosopher and scholar Edmund Burke. And they did. In 1774 in England, Edmund Burke delivered a speech to the electors of Bristol, England. And in that speech, he addressed specifically the issue of representation, how it was to work, how it was to be made operative. This particular document, Edmund Burke's viewpoint on representation, becomes the Bible of the topic as far as the founders are concerned. They all understood it. They all read it. They all bought into it and subscribed to it. Burke says the following. This is straight from his speech on November 3rd, 1774. I am sorry, he says. I cannot conclude without saying a word on a topic touched upon by my worthy colleague. I wish that topic had been passed by at a time when I have so little leisure to discuss it. But since he's thought proper to throw it out, I owe you a clear explanation of my poor sentiments on that subject. And with that introduction, Burke launches into his explanation to the electors of Bristol about the proper role of the representative in Republican government. He tells you, Burke says, that, quote, the topic of instructions has occasioned much altercation and uneasiness in this city, unquote. And he expresses himself, if I understand him rightly, in favor of the coercive authority of such instructions. Let's pause here for a minute. What does Burke mean by instructions? Burke means that in Bristol, the constituents got together and drafted instructions for their representative in Parliament. In other words, they were not going to let their own representative in Parliament make decisions on how he was going to vote. They were going to give him specific instructions on how to vote before he ever got there. In other words, they were to keep the power. The elected representative was nothing more than their agent. He was to go to Parliament to express the will of his constituents because they couldn't be there. But he had no latitude to make decisions on his own. how he voted was dictated by the instructions he carried from his constituents. And if he didn't subscribe or abide by those instructions, he would be replaced. This is the issue that Burke is taking on, the right of constituents to instruct their elected representative, the degree to which the elected representative is merely the agent of those who elected him. Burke says the following: "Certainly, gentlemen, it ought to be the happiness and glory of a representative to live in the strictest union, the closest correspondence, and the most unreserved communication with his constituents." Translation: Burke is saying it is a given that the elected representative has to know the people he represents. He has to be in union with them. He has to live closely involved with them. He has to constantly correspond with them so that he has the maximum communication with his constituents at all times. Their wishes ought to have great weight with him. Their opinion, high respect. Their business, unremitted attention. It is his duty to sacrifice his repose, his pleasures, his satisfactions to theirs. And above all, ever and in all cases, to prefer their interest to his own. In other words, the elected representative has every obligation, responsibility to know the will of his constituents, and where at all possible, to follow the will of his constituents, if he can. But, and this is a big but, excuse me. Excuse me for a slight cough there. But, he says, his unbiased opinion, his mature judgment, his enlightened conscience, he ought not to sacrifice to you, to any man, or to any set of men living. Ultimately, he makes the call, not you. He needs to make it knowing where you stand and why, but he needs to make it nevertheless. These he does not derive from your pleasure, no, nor from the law and the Constitution. They are a trust from Providence, for the only abuse of which he is deeply answerable. Your representatives owe you not industry only, but judgment. And he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices that judgment to your opinion. You elected him because you trust him to make the best decision for you. If he surrenders that judgment and goes along with what you want, he's violated the reasons that you elected him. He has ceased to be your representative and has instead become your servant. And you don't want that, Burke is saying. My worthy colleague says his will ought to be subservient to yours. If that be all, the thing is innocent. If government were a matter of will upon any side, yours, the people, without question, ought to be superior. But government and legislation are matters of reason and judgment, not of inclination. And what sort of reason is that in which the determination precedes the discussion, in which one set of men deliberate and another decide, and where those who form the conclusion are perhaps 300 miles distant from those who hear the arguments. What Burke is saying here is that Grover Cleveland's pledge against taxes violates the very basic principles of representation. Burke says clearly that the decision needs to be made on site by the interaction of the elected representative and his constituents, not by somebody 300 miles away who asks you to sign a pledge, not by the Koch brothers in Kansas who promise you campaign money to keep you in office if you vote the way they want you to vote on certain issues. You have an obligation to represent your constituents, not special interests. This is not me talking. This is Edmund Burke. This is the founders of this nation who created a republic based on representative government defined this way. To surrender your obligation to communicate with your constituents to vote according to what you believe, or what the Koch brothers believe, or what Grover Norquist believes, or what General Electric believes, or what Apple believes. And then to come back after the fact and put an article in the paper, to your local paper, to your constituents, and say, this is what we did for you. Not only is not representation, it is a violation of the principles of representation. It turns representation into something evil, something wrong. To deliver an opinion, Edmund Burke says, is the right of all men. That of constituents is a weighty and respectable opinion, which a representative ought always to rejoice to hear, and which he ought always most seriously to consider. But authoritative instructions, mandates issued, which the member is bound blindly and implicitly to obey, to vote, to argue for, though contrary to the clearest convictions of his judgment and conscience, these are things utterly unknown to the laws of this land, and which arise from a fundamental mistake of the whole order and tenor of our Constitution. If representation becomes something like this, it involves the bastardization of Republican government itself. It turns representation on its head. It makes a mockery of it. It makes a mockery of popular government. It makes the entire electoral process suspect and not worthy of further support. I would argue that more and more that's exactly what we are seeing in this nation, on the national level, on the state level, and in local districts as well. We are seeing delegates, elected representatives of the people, being bought off being promised unlimited funds for re-election, provided they vote the right way, provided they do not take their responsibilities to their citizens, to their constituents, seriously. Rather, you take your marching orders from us, and in return, we'll guarantee that you'll keep your seat, because we'll give you all the money you need to be reelected, provided you're a sure vote for what we want. Nowhere in that picture is there any room for constituents. They vote, they go through the motions of popular government, but the heart and soul, the substance of representative government is gone. The article that I'll be putting in the newspapers, the article that I put on Facebook this morning, speaks to this background. None of that background is on Facebook. The article would be 3 times the length that it is. But let me share with you what I did put on under my name as a candidate for the House of Delegates. The title, Representation, what it is and what it is not. And here's what I've said. What some are calling the most important election ever for Southern West Virginia is less than a week away. And the reason I said that is because this will not come out in the newspapers until next week, which will be within the last week of the campaign. It might seem strange, I said, for a House of Delegates candidate to single out representation for discussion at this late date. On the contrary, in this election, in this republic, especially in this state, representation is a critically important issue to address. Here's why. I've watched in horror as Republicans who've waited years for the reins of power in West Virginia to blatantly abuse it, and then brag to our citizens about all that they've done for them. In fact, to them is more appropriate. They have adopted language to confuse people, to convince them actions that hurt working people are really in their best interests. Shame on them. Examples. 1. Repealing prevailing wage. Their argument, after the fact. To repeal prevailing wage is to create jobs. By lowering pay for workers in a state that's desperate for good-paying jobs? No way. Second example. Right to work, they say, promotes workplace freedom by affirming everyone's right to a job. What it really promotes is employer freedom by denying working people their rights and a safe place to work. Civil justice reform to eliminate West Virginia's reputation as a judicial hellhole. These so-called protections for employers deny workers access to the courts. They free employers from workplace liability. They make our state attractive to those who would exploit workers, not bring them fair pay and dignity. an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. This may be the very worst thing Republicans have done to all of us. They would expose our republic to changes to the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, that we'd find it hard to recover from. In a period when all of us worry about the future of the nation, when our candidates don't talk, they scream at each other and threaten payback. Republicans would take a knife to our frame of government. 5. In the face of declining tax revenue to operate our government, our Republican legislature gave corporations an additional $110 million tax cut in this last session. To create jobs, they say. Does anyone really believe that? Six, with 60 days to adopt and pass a budget, our legislature failed us. The special session cost us an additional $600,000 and produced a budget that did little but use up more of our rainy day dollars. 7. PEIA, Public Employees Insurance Corporation. Health insurance for public employees continues to increase premiums and reduce benefits. Yet another huge cut in benefits has been proposed for 2017, a $25 million reduction in benefits beginning with next year. Our working and retired public employees have been double-crossed. They worked for much less with the promise of secure retirements and health benefits. Gone. 8th, 26 delegates, most of them Republicans, signed on to the Grover Norquist pledge never to raise taxes no matter the emergency. They imposed their ideological preferences on constituents with nary a word of explanation or discussion. Representation here is not even possible. What makes all of this, in fact, I'm going to add one more before I send it into the paper, because one of the other pieces of legislation that the Republican legislature spent time on was what they call the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is the same kind of legislation that Michael Pence was forced to rescind when he was as governor of Indiana. It's the same kind of discriminatory legislation that's currently getting all the attention in North Carolina and has led to the National Basketball Association pulling its All-Star game out of Charlotte next year. And the ACC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, Duke, North Carolina State, pulling its tournaments out of North Carolina because of this law. Because under the guise of protecting, restoring religious freedom, the law makes it possible for people to use religious freedom as a way to discriminate against gays and lesbians. That's going to be an additional bullet. What makes all of this, and there's more, much more, even worse, is that so much of it didn't even originate in West Virginia. Out-of-state special interests, awash in obscene amounts of lobbying dollars available to compliant Republican leaders and their unwitting supporters in exchange for their automatic votes, choose not to involve citizens in these issues until after the deeds are done. Representative government? Hardly. This is just what America's founders warned us about in the Federalist Papers. Demagogues who would inflame unwitting citizens in schemes designed not to benefit the community, but themselves. The self-interest of devious plutocrats. Those who have so much already, but seem to want it all. Quote, they are Coke, unquote. That, of course, is a play on the commercials we're seeing on our televisions now. We are Coke. They are Coke. And then I've concluded this piece by saying, early voting is now underway in West Virginia. It will be underway as of this coming Wednesday, tomorrow, the 26th. November 8th is Election Day. For citizens of Southern West Virginia, this is our D-Day. Our chance to take back our government from those who would abuse and defame it, and enlist it, our West Virginia, in ideological power grabs that promise us nothing. That's the piece that I posted on Facebook today. It is tied directly, although I didn't do it in the article, to the ideas and the theories of representation articulated in 1774 by Edmund Burke and adopted fully by our founders. This is the definition of representation that Madison, Hamilton, and the other supporters of the Constitution of the United States developed in order to preserve the essence of Republican government while changing the structure of government from state sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation to a strong central government under the Constitution of the United States. I really believe that this issue of representation is the critical one. If you read, and we read quite a bit of it, if you read the debates of the Constitutional Convention through the summer of 1787, an awful lot of time is spent on the issue of representation. There's general agreement about it. The states' writers believed that in order to preserve Republican government, in order to guarantee that the people remained involved in decision-making, it was necessary to locate power on the local level, closest to the people, at the state level. Madison's concern, if you remember in Federalist number 10, Madison's concern was that this didn't necessarily locate or put power in the hands of the people. Instead, it potentially put power in the hands of demagogues. Those who would whip up the people emotionally, get them whipped up on particular issues, and then take the people down very, very rosy-looking paths, which would lead to their own ruin as a republic. It would benefit the demagogues, the self-interest of the demagogues, but it would not be in the interest of the community, in the interest of the republic, or in the interest of the nation or the state or the district's future. This issue of representation, then, it seems to me, becomes a critical one in understanding the nature of our government and the nature of our election system. This is really what our election system is all about. The ability of the people to influence decision-making, not control it, We're not naive enough to believe that that direct democracy works, that all the people are qualified or capable of making the kinds of intelligent decisions that ought to dictate the way their representatives vote. None of us believe that. It doesn't make sense. But what Madison and the founders did believe is that a system in which representative and constituents were in constant communication with each other so that each could have informed the other. And when it came time for the representative to cast the vote on that particular issue, every representative, every delegate would cast a vote that was informed, a vote that everybody knew was coming. So that even though there were people within the constituency that didn't agree with the vote, they would understand why the delegate made it. That, Madison said, becomes the responsibility of the elected representative to educate his constituents. In order to educate them on the issues, you've got to communicate with them. Not after it's all over, not after the vote is taken, but before the vote is taken, so that the input can be considered, can be on the table when the decision is made. If people believe that that's really happening, and that they really do have influence on the laws passed which affect them as citizens, if people really believe that, then the republic will be strong and it will survive. But if they don't, if they believe that special interests are controlling the decision making, that their will is being ignored in the interests of big money, in the interests of large campaign contributions, in the interests of Citizens United, in the interests of corporations' ability, literally, to buy the results they want from the electoral process. When citizens believe that that's what's going on, the republic is in trouble. I would suggest we are there. There's absolutely no question in my mind that that is probably the greatest threat to the future and the viability of our representative system of government in this nation. That's why I see the call for an Article 5 convention and many of these other pieces of draft legislation that are coming out of the American Legislative Exchange Council, an organization funded by the Kochs and other large corporations that are drafting legislation and sending it to Republican majorities in the various states and pumping money into those states, into the political campaigns, in order to fund the campaigns of candidates who promise to vote their will. That, I would suggest to you, is the beginning of the end of our representative democracy. I see it coming, and I see too many people inclined to throw up their hands and conclude that there's nothing they can do about it. Yes, there is something they can do about it. And I think November 8th is a good time to start. I think voters need to send a message. I think as an elected representative, you have a responsibility to communicate with your constituents on the issues likely to come up before the next legislative session before they come up. But the one thing that you have to do, you have to present the introduction of outside alien draft legislation drafted by other interests for their own personal benefit being imposed on our state legislatures and being passed by compliant legislators who don't vote according to their own judgment and their own reason, but vote according to script, to how they are told to vote, to how those who gave them the campaign money to get them elected want them to vote, under the threat that if they dare wander away and vote in a way not consistent with what these special interests want, then these special interests will turn around and buy another prospective candidate who will be willing to do their bidding. And your political career as an elected representative will be over. I would suggest that all of these things considered together probably create the greatest threat to our political system that I've ever seen in my time. We talked about Edmund Burke's agency system. The idea that the elected representative is the agent of the people who elected him. That he comes armed with instructions on how to vote on specific issues. That's the system of representation that dominated, it seemed to me, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was structured as it was, with power on the state level, in order to make sure that that definition, that agent definition of representation was operative. That, opponents of the Constitution believed, is what representative government is all about. The people making the decisions, electing representatives who commit to follow the will of the people, and then the people's ability to give them instructions on how to vote on specific issues. Burke's argument against that was an argument for what political scientists call the trusteeship approach to representation. The elected representative is not to be the agent of his constituents, but the trustee of his constituents. He comes to the legislature armed with the authority from the constituents to use his judgment, his common sense, his reason, his understanding of issues that the constituents can't know to make the right decisions in their best interests. That is a representative acting as the trustee of his constituents, not the agent of his constituents. It seems to me, as we look back on what we've done here at the Virtual Center in previous weeks and months, there's no question that a valid way to explain the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States is to see it as a way to replace the agent approach to representation with the trustee approach. Madison's Federalist number 10 is an argument for elected representatives as trustees of their constituents. That, to Madison, is the very basis of Republican government under the Constitution. In Madison's mind, therefore, the Constitution is indeed consistent with republicanism. That's the issue, as Madison sees it. It seems to me, from the perspective of our young people, our students in civics classes and government classes and history classes, that this approach might be a very, very good one to make the case to young people as to what the new Constitution was really all about. It changed the involvement of people in the political process, while at the same time preserving their right to participate in it. In other words, it suggests what Madison has done is come up with a way to preserve participatory government and yet to undo the agent system which destroyed the Articles of Confederation. The reason being that as long as the representatives took their marching orders from home, from the constituents, there was no basis for them, no reason for them to work together, to discuss, to negotiate, to compromise, to respect alternative points of view, and to arrive at consensus positions on key issues. All the things that would move government forward were impossible under the agent system of representation. The only way that you could do that is to replace that agent system with the trustee system of representation, where trustees from all over the country representing their local constituents, having had the back and forth discussion and debates within their own districts, come armed with the authority of their people, of their constituents, to make the best decision possible on specific issues. And then they sit down with other people who have the same charge, the same responsibility, and together they find ways to make it all work, to alleviate differences of opinion, find common ground so that the different sections of the nation can work together and find common agreement on issues and perspectives. All of that is what Madison had in mind in Federalist number 10, especially, but in the other Federalist papers he wrote as well, which clarified specific aspects of it. I believe what my purpose in today's program was to make the case that representation, the very nature of representation, might be the best way possible to understand and appreciate the operation of our Republican representative democracy political system. Of all the concepts, all the principles we've talked about, it seems to me that giving people an appreciation of representation that can work and examples of representation that is not working might be the most beneficial way to get people to understand the nature of our political system, but more important, to understand the important role that citizens play in this process. Elections are designed to educate constituents on issues. They are not supposed to be ways that constituents sell voters on supporting them because I'll do what you want me to do. That is the worst thing that you can do. That violates all the principles on which our government, on which our political system is based. I do believe that this might just be the most important concept or principle in our political lexicon, if you will, in the nature of our political system. We're at 56 minutes after the hour. We've got just a couple of minutes left in our time together today. I kind of thought that this probably would take the bulk of our hour and a half. Actually, it took a little bit less than that. I think I've maybe for the last couple of minutes been kind of repeating myself and trying to emphasize these things, but at the same time, to recognize that we didn't have enough time to get into anything else at this late hour. And so the best thing to do is just to basically stick with what we've got. Let me recommend to you Edmund Burke's speech to the electors of Bristol. If you go online and Google it, just Google Edmund Burke on representation, and you will get the link to Burke's speech to the electors of Bristol. And in it, it seems to me, Burke lays out the case for a trusteeship approach to representation. Not only that, but he points out the flaws in the agent approach. If you, as the elected official, agree to vote the way somebody else tells you, you are surrendering your obligation to exercise your own judgment, your own common sense, your own logic, your own reason, your own experience, all the things that cause voters to vote for you. You are surrendering that by allowing someone else to make the decision for you. And you become their agent rather than the agent of your own constituents. I would argue then that that's actually a worse perversion of the agent system than your willingness to let your constituents give you instructions. At least they are your constituents. But when it's an outside force that has no relevant reason to know or care about what's going on in your district or with your constituents, to give them the power to make decisions for your district, it seems to me bastardizes the whole process of representative government. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for your time today. I trust that we'll be back together again tomorrow at our regular time. With the campaign season the way it is, I'm guessing, but I'm not sure. Right now, I'm planning to do a program tomorrow, but we will see. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network. Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and those folks do a great job, it seems to me. And they have earned our gratitude as well as our support. Thank you very, very much. Enjoy your evening. Be kind to each other. And Lord willing, we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.